People have always asked me, what is it like to be a beekeeper? So to help explain what it is like, I decided to create these videos to go over my experiences. I will cover lessons learned and provide explanations of what it's like to be a beekeeper. I hope you enjoyed my adventures in beekeeping. The reward from beekeeping is when you get to extract your honey. It's the climax of your hard work managing your bees, the sweet taste of fresh honey. Per harvest, you should typically harvest about 2 to 3 gallons per hive. That is about 7 to 11 liters. This will give you about 15 to 22 pints of honey. If this is a new hive or it's a cooler summer, you will have less honey. Use the hot knife to remove the caps off the comb. This allows honey to pour out of the cells. Extract honey within 3 days of harvesting your honey. If you cannot extract it, freeze your frames until you can extract your honey. I do not recommend doing this because it's harder to get the honey out of the frames. Make sure all of the honey is cleared out of the frames. You want to have little honey remaining in the frames. Extracting honey is probably the best part of being a beekeeper. I mean, out of all of the hobbies that you can possibly do, there's no other hobby that has a benefit that can feed you and so many people. I think the best part of being a beekeeper is that there's this kind of respect that goes along with it. This respect is kind of maybe like an awe that people think that, oh wow, that you deal with insects. It's not so disgusting as spiders. So what you're doing with the frame is you're cutting off the cap of the wax. You can do that with a hot knife, you can do that with a cold knife, you can do that with any of the tools themselves, but you're basically just removing the cap so that the honey can pour out of the comb. Most extractors can be purchased, but I think the best way when you're beginning to be a beekeeper is that you can rent them from a local bee association. Or I find the best thing to do is find another beekeeper and find out when they're doing their extraction, and then you guys can do them together. When going ahead and extracting the honey and you're turning the extractor, you're turning it inside so that the honey spits out of the cells, you never want to go the other way. You always want to stay in one direction. I think it's important at this point to just make sure that you're wearing a hat and that you're wearing your mask so that nothing can get into the honey. As you can see, you are right over where you're going to be dumping the honey. Flip the cells or flip the frames one by one, making sure that all of the honey has come out of the cells on that frame. And then once you have flipped over all the frames, you want to go ahead, seal it up, and then extract some more. I find that when you leave a small amount, or when you leave the amount of honey on the bottom of the extractor, this holds it down and makes it easier to extract other frames. So when you extract, this is a 3-frame extractor, so when you extract your honey from the frames, I find it easier when you extract your other frames that you leave those frames on, or that you leave that honey inside the extractor. Also, what really helps is that when you do this, that it is hot. Make sure that your garage door is shut, or if it's in your house, make sure all of the windows are shut. When you extract honey, it calls for other bees to come. I find typically if you don't get all of the honey out of the frame, and then when you freeze them, you take them out of the freezer, they kind of have a slight yeasty smell to the frames. Don't be alarmed. When you put them back into the frame, the bees will take care of it. But when you have a little bit of honey remaining, it can be a pain. Some beekeepers, after they extract the honey, they put the empty frames back on top of the hive so that the bees can go ahead and eat up the rest. I like that. I don't like that. I think the main thing is just try to get all of the honey out. Here I'm doing my first filter of the honey. This is just going to take the big chunks of wax and take them out of the honey. For my honey, I like to do 2 filters. I like to take the initial piece of the wax out. And then what I like to do is I like to go ahead and put cheesecloth in another filter so that I can filter the honey even more. When you're doing this, it does not take out little bug pieces. It doesn't take out little pieces of the wax or pieces of the bee. Make sure that you hold the cheesecloth. I'm using just kind of like a normal just strainer, but I find that this kind of makes your honey look better. It doesn't have so many chunks in it, and it gets out all the bee parts that people might complain about. As you can see the small pieces of wax that are within the cheesecloth. You can see some bee pieces. Another closer look. For the wax, I just use a coffee can. Just one of those old tin coffee cans. I will show you what to do with the wax in a later video, but here I'm just going to collect it, and voila. For the frames that I extract the honey from, I'm going to put them in the freezer. Like I said, I'm going to put them in my deep freezer for about 2 to 3 days. Make sure you have room. And then if I'm going to put them in my normal freezer, I'm going to leave them in there for 2 to 3 days, definitely 3 days. But in a deep freezer, I can leave them in there for 2 to 3 days. That doesn't make any sense. All right, for the deep freezer, I'm going to put them in there for 2 to 3 days. If I'm putting them in my normal freezer, I'm going to want to freeze the frames for 3 to 4 days. Make sure you're using those garbage bags. You don't want leaking honey in a freezing freezer. There is my son doing the happy dance because of the honey harvest. I like to just grab the bucket of honey. I use a food grade bucket, and I'm just pouring it into a pot so I can pour it into a jar. Now, you're going to want to use a jar when you are harvesting your honey, or when you're doing your extraction of your honey. Always put it in a smaller container. Real honey, this is real honey. If it's real raw honey, it will harden. And if it hardens, or they call it candy, you do not want it in a bigger container. It is such a pain to break it up and get it to liquefy again. When it's in a small jar, I'm putting it in these pint jars right now, but when you put it into a smaller jar, what happens is when it does candy, you can just put it in some hot water, not boiling water, just some hot water, and it will liquefy again. Again, when you do one hive, you should get 2 to 3 gallons of honey out of that Illinois. That is about 7 to 11 liters. This will make about 15 to 22 pints of jars of honey. Make sure that with all of the tools, with all of the jars, with all the lids that you use, you want to make sure that they're washed and that they're sterilized. If you're renting an extractor from a honey association, you do need to give this back. One thing that I like to do is I have an outside utility sink, and I can easily wash and clean up the extractor in my garage. Some people are not so lucky. And so they're looking at their extractor going, well, how do I clean it? I find that the best way to clean your extractor is taking it to a car wash if you don't have a utility sink. That way you can sit there and spray it down, clean it, and get it ready to return to the association. And these are just regular canning jars. You can purchase them online or at your local store. They're nothing fancy. And typically, you're going to get honey on the side of the jar. It's just going to happen. There's really nothing that you can do to prevent that. What I like to do is just run them underneath the hot water and get all that extra honey off. And that's how you extract honey. Some people like to give it out to their friends. Some people like to sell them. You know, it depends on what you want to do with them. I will tell you this, most people are pretty happy about your honey, and you can never go wrong with giving out your honey. I had one friend that did not jar up his honey, and he kept it in a bucket. What happened is it candied in the bucket, and he had about 2 to 3 gallons of candied honey in the bucket. And when it came time to kind of get the honey out of the bucket, it was such a pain. He had to sit there and put the bucket in the sun to try to get it warm enough so that it can loosen up. And he eventually was sitting there trying to cut it into smaller pieces. It just was a huge mess. So always try to put it in a smaller container. I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to press the like icon. Leave a comment below if there are topics you want me to cover. To watch more upcoming videos, press the subscribe button below the video.
Thank you for watching.